Again, thanks to my colleague Alistair from WikiHouse for making this connection. But what we're seeing is a sort of very 21st century version of a barn raising. Right? Again, I'm telling the story in a kind of simplistic potential perspective, where by together shaping the core products that we need for our economy, we're also potentially creating new pathways to build community and not just achieve hard outcomes, but also more fluid outcomes around trust and around living well in old age and things like that. But of course, life is not that simple. I think that a lot of the discussion in the previous session was about that, and rightly so. And many of the projects, we looked into 25 projects in detail. I've got 7 minutes left. This is an important reminder. Might as well do it myself, right? Instead of someone flagging up that it's time to go. Many of these projects, we looked at 25 in detail in the book, at least 20% of them, so 5 of them have now gone, right? So they no longer exist. And this is a network in Southwark, actually initiated by a fairly glossy design practice, but there you go, still a very good project linking, again, sort of older people's needs to spare time capacity of unemployed people, and also thereby really resolving issues around isolation, anxiety, depression on both sides, actually. But you know, it's gone. And that's the case for many civic projects, of course. Founders burn out. Very, very, very real issue that is too often not spoken about. Funding runs out. You know, business model doesn't work, etc. Right? And another good example from the book again, Brixton Village. I know the founders really well, and they did it with the best intentions. So they're the ones who brought, at that point, a really failing piece of market in a very sort of imaginative festival-like fashion back to life for a period of time. It was a real idea there about reimagining what town centres are for, and you know, thinking beyond consumption, and that's ironic, of course, because if you go to Brixton Village now, you'll see, of course, that the landowner has by and large cashed in on the goodwill created by these civic entrepreneurs in the beginning through there, and it was literally all 3 of blood, sweat, and tears that they put into it. Landowner used that to hike the prices, and now it's become a fairly banal version of itself, and it's actually much more about consumption and anything else. So what we're seeing is there's structural vulnerabilities in these projects that we like. Right? And I think it's probably an obvious point I'm making here, but this is the issue. I feel that we love this, but we're kind of reluctant to deal with that. Right? That, as it happens, is a really interesting diagram about fisheries, as it happens. The point is, it's complex, right? And it's a complex causal loop diagram that tracks the very many relationships between fisheries outcomes and a local coastal society in Latin America. And what it very convincingly shows is how even very oblique things like gang violence have an impact on fish stocks. Why? Because gang violence makes a community, makes trust very hard to maintain in a community, which makes it very hard to enforce, whether legally or in a kind of communal sense, certain shared rules around fishing or not fishing, and therefore, where there's more gang violence, ultimately you'll see that social contracts around fisheries and fish stocks are much harder to enforce. But the point is, it's part of a very complex series of interlocking and frequently kind of full of feedback type of relationships. Now, we love a good startup story, especially if we can, you know, take a picture of the opening. We don't always have the capacity to deal with the kind of the background factors that make things succeed or fail. And in that sense, everyone talks about startups these days, and in a sense, having written this book about the civic economy, we're part of that. But the current craze for startups, whether civic or social tech or otherwise, you could argue is a very typically 21st century of dealing with complexity of change, right? We're not used to inquiry into the dark matter of what sits behind this. And I think the person who most importantly kind of made this point is Elinor Ostrom, Nobel Prize winner 2009 and chronicler of the Commons. And by the way, she was when she won the Nobel Prize, the percentage of women who had won Nobel Prizes in any field, she was the first in economics. In any field, only 5% of Nobel Prize winners up to that point were women. I thought it's a relevant fact to mention. But she is phenomenal, and the point that she was making was a sort of an intellectual history of the Commons was what she had focused on. And she noticed that, of course, the 20th century was the century of state, market, public, private, privatization, socialization, very simple dichotomies, right? But her empirical work all throughout that century, looking into what governance made local economies really resilient, pointed that actually collective governance arrangements had always existed, were very, very effective, were not marginal, as was often being suggested, and actually generated very real outcomes. So she was, and still her writings make that point very powerfully, that human beings tend towards simplicity, and that's not always justified. Her research argues that we should really think about complex institutions, polycentric institutions, diverse polycentric institutions, and how they help us to be more innovative, more trustful, more collaborative, etc. And I think in that sense, the discussion about more state or less state, which was part of the discussion at the end of the previous session, is neither here nor there. I really think it isn't. In my experience, looking at these examples of the civic economy, it's not more state or less state. That's never the question. It's about what kind of state in what kind of role with what kind of relationships and expectations. So framing it differently, if this is an iceberg, it slightly looks more like an iceberg on my screen than up there perhaps, but if this is an iceberg, imagine this is an iceberg. In that case, what we see are great civic projects, and sometimes we wonder why they fail or not. But what's really going on is this whole series of questions like, are there local platforms that can support participation of diverse groups? Can founders be somehow supported to their peers as opposed to in kind of power relationships to decision makers and funders? Are area frameworks perhaps explicitly supportive of citizens to do what they do best in various entrepreneurial ways? Are there clear champions within the public sector who can really help a project navigate that kind of complexity? Can insurance be organized in a way that it doesn't do people's head in? And then more towards the bottom, can we think of supply chains in a way that really unlocks civic capacity? Melissa Mean, who's sitting in the audience who works with Noel West Media Center, supported a great project which links, I really need to crack on, huh? Which linked local people to the procurement of furniture for a large public sector new business park, which meant that all of a sudden, instead of public sector spending a lot of money on furniture through some big company, we purchased a CNC machine and we helped local people create most of the furniture for that project, and they still have that CNC machine which they can use. Can we talk about outcomes-based finance? Can we talk about a whole lot of things that enable these local ventures to really connect to perhaps big money or to bite-sized chunks of money in different ways in the beginning? Those are the questions I think that really matter and that we should discuss together. And I think interesting is that the public sector is waking up to this. So TfL, Transport for London, has actually commissioned us, as it happens, a toolkit on what they call tactical urbanism. Right? So in a sense, this stuff is now recognized as the holy grail, even of public policy making, but in very awkward ways, because will a toolkit, will a paper document unlock all the problems that mean that citizens don't think they can take charge of their roads? Probably not, but but the intention is very much there. We know something, we know more and more about what can accelerate citizens' ability to start the kind of projects that they love to do and connect them to each other. We know about the kind of spaces, I'm going to go through this quickly, and the kind of emerging models that can really again, accelerating is not always the right word because civic projects and citizens' initiatives don't necessarily want to be accelerated. They just want to do what they want to do, but can provide more fertile ground for these ideas to come up and flourish. And so the Impact Hub in Birmingham is working on that. And ultimately, this might lead to new type of finance products, which again, because there's, as you know, there's millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars supposedly wanting to be invested in outcomes and in impact investment, etc. But it hardly ever reaches the front line. So are there ways of more structurally connecting the needs and the expectations of investors and the often very diverse, very diffuse needs on the ground? That's what we're experimenting with. So again, it's a dark matter question. It's the stuff below the waterline that with this new 00 project, Dark Matter Laboratories, we try to address. And it's, I guess, this is from our website. We're not quite there with having designed the institutional infrastructures, but that's the exploration, right? That's the ambition, and hopefully we can discuss that more in a moment. And I should say that, unfortunately, because of childcare needs, at some point I have to run off, but hopefully still time to discuss. Thank you very much. Where are you? Here. Anna? Ah, good. Gotcha.
How's it work? Sorry, I didn't listen at all. Is it you?
Yeah. Let's see if it works because of the scarf.
Okay.
Okay, I wonder, yes, it seems to work. At least my voice resonates. Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And thanks to the Civic University for inviting me. And thanks, everyone, for being here. My name is Ana Margarida Esteves. I'm a sociologist. I'm currently a research fellow at the University Institute of Lisbon, Portugal. I also work with a variety of civic initiatives, including the Citizenship Academy, of which I'm a co-founder. I'm also a co-founder of an online civic project, which is known as Interface, a journal for and about social movements. But today, I came here to tell you about a little bit about the research I've been doing with alternative economic projects, so-called alternative livelihoods, for more than a decade, which are livelihoods which are normally conceptualized as being part of a so-called solidarity economy. This is a term, economia solidaria, which has first appeared more or less 20 years ago in Latin America, especially in Brazil, Argentina, and the Central American countries, and which is slowly making its way into the Western European discourse. This is a contested term, and this is a concept which is still in a state of emergence. However, it holds a very great promise, which is to lead, the so-called left wing, especially in terms of left-wing academic research and activism, to reroute economic practices and the world of work into the much larger framework, which is that of livelihoods and which is that of culture, which interconnects all of us with not only with each other, but also with all other dimensions of our lives, and which has the possibility also of making us understand in a much clearer and much more concrete way how the economy is above all a pedagogical practice, how the economy is above all a pedagogy. Not only the so-called alternative livelihoods, but also the capitalist economy. it can lead us to understand how economic practices actually structure and are structured by the way we understand ourselves, by the way we understand our relationships with each other, with the natural world, and also with the world of institutions and human culture, and how that constructs how we understand our sense of worth, what we can aspire, like Julia referred to when she quoted the work of Arjuna Appadurai. What is our role in the larger framework of society, and what is our role and our worth and our sense of possibility and capacity for achievement and for actual power in the world of political dynamics, in the world of activism, and in the world and in terms of constructing what we understand as the polis. Okay, right. So what is the solidarity economy, you may ask? Because this word solidarity has been very often misused and often devoid of its content. And it can very often sound almost like charity, as a kind of existentialism. However, from the perspective of grassroots movements, especially those from Latin America, which emerged during the mid-20th centuries, in the livelihoods developed by liberation theology, which was a space of resistance against not only authoritarian dictatorships, but also afterwards, in the period of democratic transitions, against so-called, is it structural arrangements, structural adjustment mechanisms, promoted by the IMF to supposedly reduce national debt, but actually leading to further national debt and to a general impoverishment. It is understood as an alternative development framework that is grounded in the principles of solidarity, mutualism, cooperation, equity, participatory democracy, and environmental sustainability. It sounds like a handful of norms. It sounds more or less like a normative framework which could very easily slip into moralism. However, is it the result of a kind of idealization? Are these values actually the result of a lived experience which is co-constructed and deeply rooted in everyday practice? Or is it the result of a kind of predefined model which is imposed on a lived reality that very often doesn't fit into these precepts? And that's where we can make a contrast between what is normally understood as, development in the world of international development aid institutions and national development aid programs, which tends to understand development programs and what development and wealth and well-being is supposed to be about as a kind of templates, as someone here referred to as a kind of provincial claim to universalism, something that can be abstractly defined and then just imposed on different cultures, different societies, regardless of what the lived experience on the ground, in the field is, regardless of what the aspirations which are co-constructed by the subjects which are in the fields actually are. And this kind of template reasoning tend to be based on a kind of deductive reasoning as well, thinking, okay, if development is supposed to look like this, if this is supposed to lead to these outcomes and lead to these social arrangements and lead to these kind of aspirations and ways of living and ways of interacting and ways of producing and ways of relating to resources and nature, therefore we can deduce that it can be applied to this specific circumstance, be it rural Britain, be it urban Portugal, be it Burkina Faso, be it Nepal, be it the Southern United States of America or whatever, without taking into account what's happening into the field and with a kind of symbolic participatory approach and a kind of symbolic and minimal integration of situated knowledge at best. And this template approach can be contrasted with what Albert Tervoegere, who was a minister from a West African country, Mali, I think, and who also worked for the United Nations during the period of the non-aligned movement, referred to as an endogenous and inductive approach to development, based on what he referred to as a process of decolonization of economic practice from what has been socially constructed in the industrialized West by the former colonial powers as wealth, as poverty, as development and quality of life, very much based on a modernization approach and very much based on a kind of, you know, post-colonial, but actually neo-colonial approach to what development should look like. Very mid-20th century, very much based on a kind of transference of institutional and economic models that were practiced in the ancient metropolis, in the ancient colonial metropolis. Okay, this can be considered as a kind of cultural and epistemological dimension of solidarity economy as a pedagogy. The idea of decolonizing the minds from what has been defined in the industrialized West, also within the industrialized or post-industrial West itself, by what has been defined by the mainstream culture, by capitalism as what wealth is supposed to be about, what quality of life is supposed to be about. It's about decolonizing the capacity to aspire, the very idea of what aspiration to a good life should be about, and therefore liberating creativity, liberating the capacity for grassroots movements, for people to self-organize and to collectively rediscover and co-construct the idea of what a good life is supposed to be about. Another dimension of solidarity economy as a pedagogy is the mobilization of endogenous resources. The ultimate goal is to rebuild the economy, to rebuild production, to rebuild commerce, to rebuild the financial circuits, by shifting their dynamics from the centrality of exchange value economics to a construction of economic dynamics based on use value. In a way, it's about going back to the way it used to be before imperial capitalism was developed. On another hand, it's very futuristic. It's not a kind of radical traditionalist longing. It's actually a longing for potentials, for what in Portugal we refer to saudade do futuro, a longing for the future, what could have been but can actually become in the future, a longing for the realization, actually for the materialization of a kind of potential that has been held back for a long time due to what has been imposed as the right way of being. And the goal is actually to overcome extraction and accumulation-based reasoning, therefore growth-based economics, and to promote regenerative economic practices, which actually uses what is normally understood as material and even social and cultural waste, the so-called dark matter, the shadow dimension of life and of culture, as a kind of fuel to create circular dynamics, be it by using material waste as a source of fuel, of energy, be it by using dimensions of social life and of cultural life which are relegated to what Boaventura de Sousa Santos, a Portuguese post-colonial sociologist, calls abyssal thinking, into the shadows as a result, you know, of mainstream approaches to development, and actually using that dark matter as a source of creativity, as a source of symbolic fuel as well. The purpose is to reevaluate, to rediscover the value of endogenous assets, endogenous knowledge, and skills and capabilities, and to mobilize them to build from the ground up economic practices and economic frameworks. And the plan in terms of the relationship between communities and the states and other institutions is to promote a form of economic planning based on what can be referred to as an inductive logic and also of institutional participatory mechanisms. A third dimension of solidarity economy as a pedagogy can be defined as horizontalism, a form of horizontalism based on participatory decision making. I wonder if all of you are acquainted with the idea and concept of horizontalism as defined by Marina Citrin and other radical sociologists, political sociologists. Is everybody acquainted with the idea of horizontalism? No? Okay. It's the idea of trying to reduce technocracy and hierarchy and delegation to the minimum necessary, with the purpose of overcoming technocracy and the tendency of delegating power, that kind of disempowering tendency of projecting our own power, the power we actually have, on the people we delegate to represent us, or to take decisions for us, with the purpose of actually toppling top-down decision-making and top-down forms of management, either within economic practices and institutions and organizations, and also in terms of the relationship between the economic sphere, the social movement sphere, and the state. And how do we do that? Above all, by valuing tacit knowledge, situated knowledge, knowledge built from experience, as input in managerial and political decision making. This doesn't mean that expertise, that technical and theoretical expertise should be eliminated. No way. Because that kind of attitude can very easily slip into this very contemporary tendency of building so-called false facts. And we already know what that leads to, right? Recent history has shown us that. So it's a question of actually, developing practices which use technical expertise and theory as a kind of gift wrap or chocolate wrapping, which can actually include and mobilize everyday knowledge built and developed by the grassroots. And in my research, I had the great honor, pleasure, and privilege to come across 4 different ways in which it is done in Latin America and also Europe. One of them is the workers' councils, developed by Movimiento de Fábricas Recuperadas in Argentina. Here is a very interesting and very successful example, which is that of Hotel Bauen, a hotel which in the early years, in the early days of the last decade, went into bankruptcy and then was taken over by the workers and transformed into a cooperative. And this hotel, which has recently been recognized by the state